My name is Jason, or Jeskai Jason. I am going to be doing something a little bit different today. I want to go over the list for Creature-less Jeskai Control. I've been playing it for a couple months. It doesn't seem like there's really any good primers or deck techs out there on the internet, and so I'm going to go over the different cards in the deck, kind of the lines of play and the themes and the ideas that you are going to want to think about when you're playing this deck. It's a pretty difficult control deck to play. It's very different than a lot of the other Jeskai builds that are floating around. So let's just kind of dive into it and check out what we've got here. The first thing I want to do is I want to look at the deck breakdown. So looking here, the very first thing you should notice is that one, there's no one-cost spells. You're not going to be doing anything on your first turn ever. You're going to be putting your first land into play tapped. It needs to be like a shock land, hopefully, right? The goal is to put that first shock land into play tapped, and then all of your check lands from there on will be active and will come in untapped. And you can play the cards that you want on the turns that you want to play them, simply off that first turn shock land play. So we don't play any one drops because there's not really a good reason to. Opt is possibly a good card, but we see Chemist's Insight and Revitalize often overperform in comparison to Opt for this deck. The second thing you should notice is that this deck's mostly multicolored. There's a few cards of each color. You see 4 red cards, 9 white cards is the most, but we've got 14 multicolored. So the deck is really, really heavily multicolored, so you have to be sure that you can turn those lands on and that you have that like first turn shock, or you have a basic land that can turn on your other check lands in your hand. The next thing is the reason that the deck really gets its name is it has 0 creatures. There's a 0% bit of creatures in there. A lot of Jeskai decks are playing Niv Mizzet. A lot of Jeskai decks are playing Crackling Drake. This deck is not doing that. We're not looking to ever swing on our opponent. We can win with Teferi. We can win with Fight with Fire and Explosion, and that's really our real win condition. We play 26 lands, which is not as high as plenty of control decks that I have played before, but it's a pretty fat amount of land, and that's because we really, really, really want to get to 11. The whole goal of this deck is just to get to 11. It's more of a combo deck full of control cards than it is your standard control deck where you're going to like grind out a win. When you get to 11, you pretty much win the game immediately, unless your opponent's playing counterspells. So it's very important to continue hitting your land drops, and that's why we're running 26 lands in this build. So let's take a look at the actual cards in the deck and think about the lines of play and what the cards do for us in getting there. Now, as I said, this isn't exactly your standard control deck. It's really into cast Fight with Fire with Kicker for 10 at your opponent's face, and then cast Expansion on it, which says that it can copy a spell with converted mana cost 4 or less. Well, while this Fight with Fire's on the stack, regardless of whether you kicked it or not, its casting cost is 3. So we double it, and what happens is we deal 20 for 11 to our opponent. Directly to the face, over and done with. That's our whole goal. And in the meantime, don't die. Right? So what we're doing is we're going to play cards that make sure that we have those pieces on turn 11, or possibly can win on turn 9 in the case of Mirari Conjecture, and we're going to try to control the game in the meantime. So the first card on our list is Revitalize. It is kind of a sleeper. You wouldn't think, oh, this is a really great card looking at it. It's a common from M19. It's gain 3 life, draw a card for 2. You know, long ago in a galaxy far away, slightly after Urza's Saga, they asked all the pros what it would take to play a life gain card, and they said they'd need 1 life for 10. Well, or 1 mana for 10 life. Well, we're paying 2 for 3 here, and we love it. The 3 life is extremely relevant, especially in the burn matches, especially now that they got that additional spectacle bolt you're just seeing 3 damage flying at your face repeatedly over and over and over. And this card gives us a great play on turn 2 to go up a little bit, even against those decks that play a turn 1 threat, and also draw into more lands or a Fight with Fire or an expansion so that we can try to go ahead and win the game. Also in the aggro matches, typically the cards we end up drawing with this are, if they're not Fight with Fire and expansion, they're Deafening Clarions and Settle the Wreckages. So Revitalize almost makes our deck 56 cards. And that's really great. It's not ever going to be Gitaxian Probe, right? And obviously if it was, it'd probably get banned, right? But it is really, really good for this deck. A lot of times what you'll see like a Gitu Firewalker or a Fanatical Firebrand come down on turn 1, or something that is not dealing the 3. And so what this becomes is basically a Time Walk, which is really solid for us. Negate, we got one of that card. There's lots of good non-creature spells floating around. It counters Planeswalkers. It counters all kinds of cool stuff. Vraska's Contempt, namely, that there's a million reasons to play this card. I am playing Search for Azcanta, and a lot of the Creature-less Jeskai builds are not playing this card. I am really hedging towards beating them with this card, because in the control matches, in the matches where you're dealing with blue-black and they have the thought erasures, and you're just getting to the point where you're in the middle of the grind, nothing is really better than Azcanta. Azcanta flips into a land, which is what your deck needs, and then it basically draws you 2 cards a turn. That's great for when you're going up against the control match. Yeah, it tends to board out a little bit when we're playing against aggro, and that's because it's very slow. However, a lot of times a flipped Azcanta late can win you the game against aggro, because it's going to be digging for those additional Settle the Wreckages, Deafening Clarions, Cleansing Novas that you have inside the sideboard and in the main that just beat those aggro decks. So Search for Azcanta is really good on the flip. It's also excellent to help you get to the cards that you need to win the game, regardless of what your opponent's playing. If they're playing control, put the settles in the graveyard. If they're playing beatdown, maybe you want to skip that land drop to try to get a removal spell, or skip a absorb to get the removal spell. We'll talk about absorb in a minute. You might not skip the absorb. It's really good. We're playing 1 Lava Coil in the main. There's more in the sideboard. Arclight Phoenix is still a thing, unfortunately, barely. So there's 1 in the main. It's also just real good removal. You'll notice that it's my only piece of 2-drop removal, which goes in a different route than Arnaud Hocquemiller's version that he played at the World Cup. Hocquemiller played 2 Seal-Aways, and I think looking at the new set and everything that's come out, I think the Seal-Aways are going to be very weak against Golgari and Gruul and Jund builds. And so I'm really looking to hedge against those, which I think are going to be the main aggro that we see outside of White Weenie and Mono Red. So Fight with Fire is your win condition. It's also a great piece of removal. Fight with Fire deals 10 if you kick it to the player, usually, or divide it however you want. Sometimes you got to kill guys with it. But on its own, Fight with Fire is a 3-mana spell that deals 5. 5 kills opposing Niv Mizzets, which is a really big deal. It kills a lot of things with a really fat ass. This card shoots down Aurelia, and that's really important. Don't be afraid when you're playing this deck to use your Fight with Fires as removal spells. You can get them back, and so it's not something that you can usually be worried about. Also, typically, if you're playing against the aggro decks, just burn through them as removal spells anyway. Once the board is clear and you've established clear dominance of card advantage and you drop a Teferi or a Ral, the game is over. There's no way they're going to beat it. You're going to implement, they're going to scoop, or you're going to play out the motions and they're going to lose. So you oftentimes don't even have to go with the Fight with Fire method against aggro if you feel like you can use that as a burn spell. you're very, very safe. Aggro's pretty much a match, and mid-range often too are pretty much matches that you're nearly guaranteed to win. You are very favored in matches like Golgari. You probably have a 60-70 to beat that deck. And it's the #1 deck in the format right now. So that's makes you feel pretty good on the inside. Now, the next card to look at is one that I'm playing differently than Arnaud. And I was playing the Ionizes for a while. I tried Sinister Sabotage. I tried Syncopates. I tried a lot of different counter spells in this slot. And what I found is that Absorb is insane. Absorb is really good in the mirror match because it puts me out of range of a doubled fight with fire. They basically have to get the Conjecture to beat me, and then I can just hold for counterspell for that. Also, it's really good in the beatdown matches. When you counter a dude and you gain 3 life, or you counter a burn spell and you gain 3 life, the swing is massive, especially in this format full of additional bolts, right? I have been playing, it seems, non-stop against red-black, and they just keep bolting me. Mono-red bolts me out of nowhere. That Spectacle card is insane. Experimental Frenzy is still a thing. So your life total going to 23 sometimes isn't as safe as your life total going to 26, 29. So with the 3 absorbs, the 4 revitalizes, we're literally sitting on 21 main deck life gain that we can utilize against those stacks. Deafening Clarion's probably the best sweep in the format, especially for the early game. It's going to kill all their dudes. Against Golgari, it sweeps pretty much their whole board except for Carnage Tyrant, or if they're playing like Nullhide Ferox. So that's great. Against the Celestia tokens deck with the flourishes and stuff, I mean, it kills literally their whole deck. Ixalan's Binding is a card that wins you matches by itself. Ixalan's Binding comes down, and what you want to try to do is you want to force it on their best card. If you're playing against Control, force that onto their Teferi. If you can put it on their Teferi and maintain it, you've won that game. Just straight up. If you are playing against Golgari, for example, I would suggest Wild Growth, or Wildling Walker, or Wild Growth Walker, right? The guy that gains 3 life every time you explore. He's really rough on this deck because we are trying to shoot you to death. And so them gaining life and going to 38, 40 can be really hard on a Jeskai Control deck. Especially when you're just supposed to shoot them in their face. Settle the Wreckage, this card, also for Golgari and the other aggro decks, but this card should just have Carnage Tyrant written on it. What I see too often is people get excited to settle the Wreckage their opponents, and they cast the spell when they possibly could have removed another way, and maybe, you know, like take 2 from one of the guys, kill the big dude, and keep the Settle the Wreckage in their hand, and just barter with their life total. And too often, folks are like, oh, I really want to get this 2-for-1. 2-for-1s are great, but be aware. This card is specifically for Carnage Tyrant. If Carnage Tyrant hits and you don't have a Settle the Wreckage or a Cleansing Nova, you just lost the game. You cannot beat it. And so you need to be very careful to ensure that you keep these cards for those threats when at all possible. Chemist's Insight plays right along with what our deck wants to do. We want to draw cards so that we can play a land every single turn up to 11, and we have both those pieces in our hand. This card is perfect. It draws you 2 cards at the end of your opponent's turn, usually immediately on turn 4, unless you have to Settle the Wreckage. And then a lot of times, the very next turn, it draws you 2 more cards. It gets you there. It finds answers to everything. It comes back. If they counterspell it, you just get to jumpstart it and draw more cards. This card is insane. I want to play 4 like Arnaud did. I simply can't find the room because I'm playing more sweeps than he is. He wasn't playing the Cleansing Nova in the main. He was playing 1 less Teferi. He was playing less Settle the Wreckage. I'm more worried about the aggro that came out of this set, and so I think that that's going to be a big concern. But 3 Chemist's Insight is often enough. It's going to get you there. You're going to be able to find the pieces that you need to win the game. Cleansing Nova, I included in my main for 2 reasons. 1, it's just another sweep, which is great. But 2, it's really, really, really good against a lot of decks on the artifact and enchantment end, right? It can kill an opposing Search for Azcanta. It can kill an opposing Ixalan's Binding. It can kill a Disinformation Campaign, which that card by itself will beat you game 1. It will beat you. If you don't Ixalan's Binding it or Cleansing Nova it off the table, that card's going to beat you. They're going to continue surveilling and putting it back in their hand and putting it in play and discarding cards from your hand. And 1 or 2 might not feel that bad, but it's going to get to a point where you're choosing whether or not you discard Mirari Conjecture or Expansion Explosion, and you don't know what to do at that point. So Cleansing Nova can really help us out of a lot of really sticky situations. Also, there's some other really big artifacts and enchantments that are coming from this new set. I played against a dude that dropped 2 copies of the new Gruul enchantment that gives your guy haste or whatever, gives your guy riot, and I can't counter your spells. Cleansing Nova is really good against that because you can get it off the board and then start countering their spells again. Mirari Conjecture, this is a piece that I originally did not play with until I saw Arnaud Hocquemiler's deck. We were sort of on the same game plan. I was playing Azor's Gateways to try to win that way with a backup plan with Explosion and Banefire. This card just does everything that I wanted to do and more. Mirari Conjecture is absolutely a win condition. It will 1 return expansion to your hand, on 2 return Fight with Fire to your hand, and on 3 win you the game. When you cast Fight with Fire and it's on 3, it doubles it to 20. If you then cast an expansion, it doubles the expansion, so it copies that Fight with Fire 2 more times, doing 4 separate spells that deal 10 damage to any number of, split between targets, right? This card wins you the control match. They can't counter 3 of them or 2 of them, more than likely. It's kind of like when you play Storm in Vintage or Legacy. You put so many spells out, it doesn't matter if they have a Force of Will. They have to have Flusterstorm, right? Well, we're in the same situation here. Look, hey, here's 4 Fight with Fires that are dealing 10 to your face. You have 22. What are you going to do? If they counter 2 of them, great. I've probably got some burn to end it with Explosion, right? And oftentimes people ignore that too. If your opponent's at 24 or something, just shoot them in their face for 20 and then burn them off the table with Explosion. It's very much a win condition. Another thing I want to say about Mirari Conjecture is that in the aggro match, oftentimes, I just use this to draw more answers, right? It comes down on 5, I put a Settle the Wreckage back in my hand, right? Then the next turn, I put a Deafening Clarion back in my hand or a Fight with Fire back in my hand, right? And then if it gets on the 3rd, yeah, maybe I can, double a Revitalize to gain 6 life. Maybe I can double Lava Coil a guy or double Fight with Fire 2 guys, or, I might draw a ton of cards off of Chemister's Insight. But typically what happens with Conjecture in the aggro matches is that you don't use it as your win condition because you don't need to shoot them for 40. Most of the aggro decks aren't gaining a single point of life all game, so you can just go with the game plan of, I'm going to shoot you for 20, right? So use your Conjecture to get back answers. Don't be afraid to waste it against the aggro matches, because that's exactly what it's there for, is to help you get to the point where you can win the game. Whether it is winning the game with the Conjecture or winning the game through the spells that the Conjecture gives you to let you keep the board clear. Lastly, don't be afraid against those decks that aren't gaining any life to drop this card on turn 7. As long as you have a Fight with Fire and you've got a couple lands, right? Because if this goes off and you drop your 9th land and you cast the Fight with Fire, you just won the game. So don't be afraid to cast this hard cast, turn 7, take a chance. You're playing 26 lands. You got one in hand maybe. Go try to draw into that 9th one and win the game. A lot of times what happens with Conjecture is your opponent will just scoop to it because they know it's a clock that they cannot beat. And so this card becomes yet another win condition in this deck full of tools. Teferi, everybody knows this guy. He's arguably the best card in Standard. He's proven in Modern to be honestly better than Jace the Mind Sculptor. And it brings up an interesting point. I play Jeskai in Modern as well, okay? I play Jeskai Control. It's my favorite kind of control. And this deck feels like I'm playing Modern against a bunch of Standard decks. And the last time I could really say that was a thing was when Stoneblade existed. This deck feels like I'm playing Stoneblade, and I still to this day play Stoneforge Mystic. I play D&T and Legacy, but this deck feels like Modern. Sometimes the advantage that you have in a game, and you see your opponent just trying to do everything they can to beat you, and you can just see your advantage there, and you know there's no way that they're going to beat you. This guy solidifies the game. If he hits and they can't answer him, you win, period. Ral is a great one of that most Jeskai Control decks aren't playing, and it boggles me. It boggles my mind. What happens with Ral is he becomes a win condition in a bunch of matches. Yeah, you can drop him for 5 and shoot a dude off and then make them like waste a turn killing him and buy yourself some time to get to your Fight with Fire plan, right? It's always worth your time to drop a Planeswalker and make them waste 2 turns, right? Because we know, and as often our opponent does not, that they only have 11 turns to play the game and then we're going to kill them, right? So buying a couple turns with him is fine, but oftentimes what happens is you're just going to sit there and +1 this dude until you win the game with his emblem. If they don't answer Ral, his emblem wins you the game willy-nilly every single time. Boom, bam. As soon as you get his emblem, it's over. They might as well scoop. You have 1 billion instants in your deck. So Ral is another win condition, and that's what makes this deck so resilient against like Unmoored Ego plans, for example. You can rip out all my Teferis out of my deck if you want to. I'm still going to beat you with Fight with Fire. Oh, now you ripped out the Fight with Fires? I'm still going to beat you with Ral. I'm still going to beat you with Explosions. And more than likely, since it's game 2, I've got some other really great stuff coming in from my board. The last card that's like a card to talk about in the deck is really the MVP of the entire deck, and it's Expansion Explosion. This card does so much. On the right side, it's just brilliant, right? Every control deck wants a card like this. Deal some damage and draw X cards, right? Anything that says draw X cards has traditionally been very good for control decks. Think back to Sphinx Rev. Think way back to Stroke of Genius. Think before that to Brain Geyser. All of these cards made massive impacts on the formats in which they were involved. Explosion is no different. This card oftentimes will kill a creature or a planeswalker and draw you up to a point where your card advantage is 2 to 3 cards greater than your opponent's, and from that point on, you're going to be winning the game. On the other side, expansion is bonkers. There's a billion things you can do with expansion. You can expansion a Revitalize on the worst, right? Expansioning Revitalize gains you 6 life and draws you 2 cards. Not too shabby. Not too great, but not too shabby. You can expansion a Lava Coil and kill 2 dudes. You can expansion Fight with Fire to either win the game or kill 2 dudes. You can expansion Deafening Clarion to deal 6 to everything, which will kill Carnage Tyrant. The number of times that I have had to expansion a Deafening Clarion to kill Carnage Tyrant for 5 is out of this world. Do not overlook that play. Because as we said, Carnage Tyrant will beat you every time. Expansion in Chemist's Insight is crazy good. Expansioning your opponent's spells is really, really good. Expansioning their counter spells is epic level. Okay? When they counter your spell and you counter their counter spell with their own counter spell by copying it with expansion to force your spell through, that is a monster win. Right? So this card does so much. It's just an absolute powerhouse in this deck. The last thing here in the main is the land base. We've got 4 basics, 2 plains, 1 island, and 1 mountain. And we run the 2 plains because you have to be able to cast Settle. And also ratios. If you look at the rest, we've got 4 Glacial Fortress, 3 Hollowed Fountain, 4 Sulphur Falls, 3 Steam Vents, 4 Clifftop Retreats, and 4 Sacred Foundries. So mostly what we're playing is like a 4-3 mix of check to shock, right? And that's because we want more checks than we get shocks. The shock lands tax us in one way or another. Either we're going to pay life or we're going to put them into play tapped. And oftentimes, we don't want to do either one of those things, especially if I have to play Settle the Wreckage this turn, or I have to cast Cleansing Nova this turn. So you want to try to keep your mix there. I've honestly thought about ripping out the Sacred Foundry for maybe an island or another plains, because my mana base is pretty safe, but I don't know if I want to do that. If you look at the land situation, we've got 14 lands that count as like a plains, mountain, or island. So that turns on all 12 of the checks. So the land base is pretty solid. Hallowed Fountain did wonders for us out of this set coming out. So that's the main deck that we go in. Game 1, we're trying to beat them, fight with fire, expansion, you lose, right? Well, what happens game 2? Well, it matters against a couple different decks. Here's my sideboard that I'm running. If we're going up against aggro, we have a number of weapons in the board. We have more lava coils to add more early game kill spells to our deck, right? We don't want to add Shivan Fires or Shocks because, again, on turn 1, we really want to be playing that land tapped. So there's no real reason for us to play a 1-drop kill spell, okay? Also, I'm adding in another Deafening Clarion, and another Settle the Wreckage, and another Cleansing Nova, which will bring me to a total of 10 main deck sweeps. And that may seem like a lot, especially for a lot of lists that you see nowadays. And over the last 4 or 5 years of people playing Control, that may seem like a lot. But really, let's take it back real quick to like 2004. That was totally fine. Right? And it's fine again. A sweep is still a kill spell in decks that are going to get there. And Revitalize helps us get there. I'm also playing Fiery Cannonade because I want yet another sweep. So that'd bring me to 11. So what if we aren't playing against Beatdown? We can also bring in Fight with Fires against the Beatdown decks. That can happen. If you're playing against decks that are not black, or Lyra is usually a really, really good board in, especially against aggro decks that are dealing a lot of damage, doing a lot of burn. And I know this is called Creature-less Jeskai, but realistically, she's way too good against mono red. If you drop her against mono red, a lot of times she just wins the game by herself. So it's really important to pull her in from the board against decks that are going to get your life total really low and aren't going to be able to simply kill her with a kill spell like black, right? We've got some extra counterspell defense here in the board. We've got 2 negates because Planeswalkers suck. Also, in the mirror matches, we're going to be able to need to force through our win conditions, and that's really important. So that's why you see the 2 negates. You see 1 Sinister Sabotage coming in from the board because we don't need to bring in another Absorb because we know that we're going to be playing against a control deck. And we don't have enough Ionizes to make it an Ionize because dealing the 2 damage is probably unimportant if they've either gained 3 or like 4 or 5. that's going to be completely pointless. So we might as well get something out of our counterspell. So here comes Sinister Sabotage, right? The next card against them is going to be Conjecture. In the control matches, board in the second Conjecture. It's super duper good. I don't know how many times my opponent has gotten super duper excited because I counterspelled my first Conjecture and I dropped a second Conjecture in the next turn and they scooped. People don't expect you to play more than one copy of this card. It's your finisher. It's not a card that people expect you to play two of. And so they will throw everything at the first one to counter it because they feel like it means they win the game. Having the second one as backup is really good, especially considering your game plan can go wrong. Azcanta is a thing, the treasure map's a thing, there's a billion of these cards that flip, so there's a couple cards. Invoke the Divine, really good against artifacts and enchantments, right? This is going to take out our opponent's search, this is going to take out our opponent's treasure map, so we want to play this card to ensure that we don't suffer the consequences of the same cards we play. Rubble Reading, same thing. If they manage to flip it, this card destroys target land, and we scry 2. It doesn't cost 7 like the star does. I can't remember the name of it, but it doesn't cost 7 like that spell that deals 20 to everything and destroys a land. This card is more slick. This card is more back-upable. I'm far more likely to be able to back this up with a counter spell. And so I chose to play this card. One of, because I feel like in those control matches where it's most likely to come in, I'm usually killing like the one of land. So that's my board. I think, oh, extra Fight with Fire against control. Another win condition, right? Let's put in win conditions. I was playing Niv Mizzet in my board. And what I found was, even though when I cast him, he replaces himself because they immediately kill him, he wasn't doing much. Typically what I was doing is I was like paying 6 to draw a card and deal like a damage or 2. And so that's why I cut him for another Fight with Fire. It may make me a little more susceptible to Unmoored Ego, but I feel like in the matches where Unmoored Ego is going to be a thing, I'm going to be bringing in the 2 more negates and the Sinister Sabotage as well. So I should be safe. And another Mirari Conjecture at that. So anyway, that's kind of the deck tech. Those are the cards that we're playing in the deck. Again, this is a deck tech on Jeskai Creature-less Control. And I think the most important thing to take away from this deck is really make sure you use your life total as a bargaining chip. We know for a fact that as long as we draw our spells, they lose the game on turn 11 if they're not playing counter spells or life gain, right? So your goal should always be to get to 11. Counter spells wisely. Use your sweeps for 2-for-1s. Save Settle the Wreckage for Carnage Tyrant because he will beat you by himself. Yeah, this deck's just all about patience. Just keep making sure you make land drops every turn and you're going to win the game eventually. All right. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll be back on again later today and in the future on Twitch streaming more Jeskai play. I will be keeping my Twitter updated for the event in Indianapolis, the Star City event. So make sure that you keep that checked out. Again, come check out the streams all day. I'm going to go eat lunch. I'll be gone for 10-15 minutes. And then I'll be back on stream. And thank you, everybody, for watching the deck tech. And talk to you later.